The first sound was the hiss of rounds cutting the air, tearing chunks from the cinder-block wall inches above Specialist Jonakin's helmet. The street in eastern Mosul already full of dust and the sharp echo of automatic fire bouncing between ruined buildings as he pressed into the cracked plaster and tried to make his body smaller than his plate carrier would allow, his breathing loud in his own ears as the platoon's radio net dissolved into overlapping calls. Red 1, contact front, 3 o'clock, multiple shooters, taking accurate fire. We are pinned. Repeat, we are pinned. Mingling with someone else's shout about a casualty and another voice yelling for smoke, and under all of it the brutal, steady hammer of a PKM somewhere high to their left, the rounds chewing into the busted-out car that a team had taken cover behind until one of the Rangers screamed that he was hit and went silent, and Keem could see nothing but the shattered street, the bodies of burnt-out cars, and the faint shape of their objective building through the haze, still 3 blocks away and now impossibly far. When a new sound cut into the mess, a single clear rifle crack that didn't echo like the others, sharp and clean from somewhere north, over the rooftops, the PKM stuttered, a pause where there shouldn't have been one, then another crack, and the gun went dead altogether, its last rounds winding off into the distance as the gunner's silhouette in the high window jerked backward and vanished. Keem blinked, pressed his cheek further into the wall, felt grit in his teeth, the comm still a mess. Contact building 2, 3rd floor. That window. Another crack. Another hostile shape dropped near the rooftop parapet to their right. The return fire faltered, and he heard his own voice before he'd thought it through. Thumb pressing his PTT, words pushed out between gasps. Break. Who is that? Is that a girl firing? And the net went weirdly quiet for half a heartbeat. The chaos still there in the background, but the talking stopped. A handful of men listening to the same clean shots, the absence of PKM fire, the sudden shift in pressure on the street as yet another crack sounded and a distant figure with an RPG on a balcony jerked and toppled sideways so that his launcher clattered, unused, against the railing. Nobody answered him. Just the company commander coming in tight and controlled, anger and focus in his voice even as rounds still snapped overhead. I don't care who it is. Keep that fire up. Identify and mark targets. Push, and even as Keem ducked to throw a smoke grenade downrange, he caught himself counting. The cracks, one after another, measured and sure, each followed by a visible collapse of an enemy position they hadn't even fully spotted yet. The kill zone thinning out shot by shot. The street shifting from death trap to something survivable, long. Before he had a name, a face, or even a clear sight of the person behind that rifle that sounded like a metronome in the madness. 3 days earlier, the air at the forward operating base on the outskirts of Mosul smelled like diesel exhaust, hot dust, and the faint metallic tang of a place that had seen too many tourniquets and too many medevacs. The T-walls lined up like gray teeth around the perimeter and helicopters pulsing overhead as Staff Sergeant Maya Cortez stepped off the back of a lumbering resupply truck with her ruck on her shoulders and her M110 slung across her chest, boots crunching gravel as she followed. A hurried movement NCO toward the plywood door of the battalion TOC. She wore her ACH clipped to her pack, tan ball cap shading dark eyes that skimmed the compound with automatic precision, noting where the towers were, how the machine guns were placed, how the blast berries were angled, small reflexes that had sunk into her bones years ago, down in another city whose name most of these kids only knew from news footage. Her uniform looked like everyone else's, dusty OCPs, faded name tape, but she moved with a compact economy, each step measured, shoulders relaxed but not careless, and her kit told a slightly different story. Small strips of electrical tape over rattling buckles, gutted paracord lacing a pouch so it wouldn't flap, a faintly worn 1st Infantry Division patch, and a subdued combat patch on the right sleeve. Ramadi 2006. The colors long gone, but the outlines still clear if you knew what you were looking at. The Rangers in the TOC glanced up as she came in with a movement NCO, eyes flicking to the rifle first. M110, glass with a scope that had seen better days but was meticulously maintained. Then to her face, the quick assessment of strangers. No one said anything rude. They were too professional for that. But she caught the way 2 privates exchanged a glance near the map table, one of them smirking just a little as he muttered quietly, They're sending us a babysitter. The other's snorting. Yeah, bet she's never seen real contact. And Maya let it roll off, the words flowing around the shell she'd long ago grown under worse voices, worse doubt. The company commander, Captain Davis, was brisk and controlled, shaking her hand. Staff Sergeant Cortez, attached marksman. Right? Welcome to Alpha. He didn't look down on her, didn't look past her either, just folded her into the mission with the efficient calm of someone juggling 1,000 worries at once. We've got a series of clean-hold ops in the Ulsamar neighborhood. ISIS dug into multi-story buildings, lots of overlapping fields of fire. You will be with the Overwatch element. He gestured at a wall map riddled with colored pins, string traced between them like veins. A logistics sergeant, older, with tired eyes and a coffee mug that had seen better days, looked twice at the faded Ramadi combat patch on her arm and the small, almost invisible sniper school badge pinned above her pocket, but said nothing, his mouth tightening for a moment like he remembered something, then going slack again as another task pulled him away. No one asked her about it. She signed for a bunk in a crowded tent that smelled of men, dust, and cheap soap, dropped her ruck on the lower frame, and sat there for a moment, rolling her stiff shoulders as laughter rippled from a card game 2 cots over. They glanced at her, then away, awkward silence filling the space where an introduction should have been. She just reached for her rifle, laid it across her knees, and began a slow check from muzzle to stock, fingers moving with quiet certainty over the worn metal and polymer, counting lugs, feeling for imperfections, her mind already jumping ahead to distance, routes, possible vantage points. From outside, someone shouted about a volleyball game near the burn pit. She tuned it out. Over the next 2 days, the base turned into a pattern of rehearsals and briefings, of maps taped to plywood and whiteboards scribbled with grid coordinates and call signs, the Rangers flowing around her like a practice machine as she slid into one small part of it. The Overwatch team assigned to ride herd over the main assault elements during the push into Ulsamar. The team consisted of 2 Ranger snipers, Sergeant Hale and Specialist Rudd, both in their early 20s with lean faces burned brown by the Iraqi sun, and now her, the outsider. They were polite, even friendly in a cautious, testing way, but it was laced with quiet condescension, the kind that came more from assumption than malice. On the first afternoon, up on a hastily built range on the edge of the FOB, Hale paced in front of the 3 of them, holding a laminated sheet with wind charts like he was giving a class, though it was obvious he'd given it 100 times before. All right, we'll check 0 at 100, then confirm at 600, he said, voice calm and confident. Remember, out here you're gonna see variable crosswinds coming in off the river, so you don't just trust your first dope. You watch the mirage, the trash, the flags. His eyes flicked to Maya, slowing just a fraction. You good with dope, Staff Sergeant? Need a refresher on range estimation or wind calls? She slid a magazine into her rifle without looking up. I'm good, she said. Neutral, no edge, but his tone had already mocked his assumption. On the line, the 2 Rangers went first, prone behind their rifles, their shots ringing out in quick succession. At 600 meters the steel plates chimed. 1, 2, 3. The group's respectable but loose, a few inches left, a few low, the spread acceptable for combat. They stood, cleared their weapons, and stepped back, confident. When it was her turn, she lay down, pulled the stock into her shoulder, and let her breathing settle. 600 meters had once been point-blank to her. She checked the wind with the edge of a small piece of cloth tied to her barrel, glanced at the mirage through her scope, adjusted 1/2 mil, and squeezed off 3 shots. The steel dinged 3 times in rapid succession, the rifle barely moving off target. When the range safety walked down to paint targets between strings, he paused at hers. 3 holes almost touching, tight enough to cover with a thumb. Hale sauntered over, peered through his binos, and grunted, not bad for a first-timer. He believed it, too. You'll get even tighter once you've done it a while. Maya said nothing. She'd been shooting at men at twice that distance when he was still in middle school, but if he wasn't ready to know that, she wasn't going to waste breath. She returned to the ready line and began breaking her rifle down, fingers moving fast and automatic. Bolt, carrier, firing pin. Everything laid out in neat order on a scrap of poncho liner in under a minute. Rudd watched her reassemble it without a word, eyes narrowing as he saw how smoothly it went back together. No fumbling, no pause to remember any step. "You timed that, Hale?" he asked finally. Hale shrugged. "She's been practicing." The small slights added up. In the TOC, during mission planning, she sat at the back of the room as Captain Davis traced the planned route of the armored vehicle through a series of narrow streets, laser-pointed dancing between structures. "Overwatch team will occupy this rooftop here," he said, tapping one building north of the main route. "Primary sector of fire along this axis. Secondary to the west. We need early warning on any elevated firing positions." One squad leader, a rough-faced staff sergeant named Morrow, raised a brow. "So, you sure about putting her up there alone?" he said, nodding toward Maya without looking at her directly. "That's a lot of responsibility for someone we don't know." The room's mood shifted, a few heads turning slightly. Davis's jaw flexed. "That's a lot of responsibility for any of you," he replied evenly. "Staff Sergeant Cortez is assigned by brigade. She's qualified, or she wouldn't be here." That's the end of that discussion. Morrow muttered, "Roger, sir," and dropped it, but the words hung there, sticky, lodging in the minds of every young ranger in earshot. A question mark attached to her name that she could feel even when their faces stayed blank. At night, while they were in the chow tent shouting about sports and girls and home, she sat alone at the end of a table, MRE spoon in one hand and a thin notebook in the other, lines of tiny writing filling page after page, range cards, sketches of the neighborhood from satellite imagery, rough outlines of possible sniper hides and fallback routes. Her range card for the assigned rooftop grew dense with annotations, elevation differences, likely muzzle flashes based on reported ISIS positions, the way the morning sun would fall on certain windows. When she finished, she slid it into a waterproof sleeve and hooked it to her kit, then went back over her gear under the weak light of a hanging bulb, touching each piece, checking nothing had migrated or loosened. No one offered to help. No one asked about her notes. But the logistics sergeant from earlier paused once in the tent's doorway, seeing her alone with the rifle in pieces and the old Ramadi patch catching the light. His lips parted as if to say something. Then a runner called his name and he disappeared again. She exhaled, slow, and told herself it was fine. She hadn't come here to be liked. She'd come here to do what she knew how to do. They rolled out at dawn under a sky the color of dirty cotton, the Striker's engines thrumming, dust plumes curling behind the convoy as it left the safety of the FOB. Inside one of the lead vehicles, the air was hot and cramped, the men packed shoulder to shoulder with their gear, helmets clacking every time they hit a bump. Maya stood near the rear hatch, one hand wrapped around an overhead strap, the M110 secured between her knees. Hale and Rudd were wedged on either side, checking their optics and radios. "Remember," Hale said into the intercom, mostly for the benefit of the assault element, "wear your eyes up high. You get lit up, call it, and we'll put glass on it." His tone had that careless confidence that only comes from not having been badly surprised yet. Maya stayed quiet, eyes closed for a moment as she replayed the map in her mind. Streets, intersections, side alleys, the tall apartment block that they'd used for Overwatch. When they dismounted, the neighborhood greeted them with silence. Not the peaceful kind, the sort of light, brittle quiet that comes just before something breaks. Bombed-out buildings loomed on both sides, rebar poking from shattered concrete like exposed bone, trash swirling in weak gusts of wind. The air smelled of old smoke and spilled oil. They moved in disciplined stacks, shadows slipping from doorway to doorway, boots crunching broken glass. The Overwatch team peeled off early, cutting down a side alley and through a hole in a courtyard wall, bounding up a crumbling stairwell to the 5th floor of an apartment building that had half its front wall missing. The rooftop they chose was less a rooftop and more a jagged rim of concrete and twisted metal. From there, Maya could see most of the primary route the Rangers would take, the street running straight, then bending slightly left past a cluster of taller structures, the likely kill zone if ISIS had any sense. She lay behind a low parapet, unfolding her bipod, while Hale set up a spotting scope beside her and Rudd took a secondary arc with his own rifle. They established comms, confirmed sectors, and settled in. For nearly an hour, nothing moved except a stray cat and a piece of plastic cord on a wire. The Rangers advanced methodically below, voices low, occasionally vanishing into doorways as they cleared each building. Maya's heartbeat slowed, her breathing even, her mind narrowing to the space inside her scope and the radio in her ear. Then everything exploded. The first burst of fire came from their 11 o'clock, a ragged roar from an upper-floor window 2 blocks down. The muzzle flashes faint in the daylight but unmistakable in her optic. At the same time, another line of traces stitched across the street from their 2 o'clock, and a third position opened up deeper in the neighborhood. The bark of AKS and the unmistakable harsh stutter of PKM. The Rangers in the street dove behind cars and into doorways. One man in second squad spinning as a round clipped his shoulder, his scream muted in Maya's headset by the sudden flood of overlapping radio calls. Contact! Contact! Building 3, high, multiple shooters. Red 2 is pinned. We need smoke on that intersection. Someone else shouted about a casualty, another about losing sight of the far building. Smoke grenades spat gray clouds into the air, but the enemy had already done their homework. Their fields of fire overlapped, catching the Rangers whenever they tried to shift. Maya's world shrank to targets. In her scope, she saw the first shooter lean out of a shattered third-floor window, long hair and a black headband framing a face she didn't let herself see as a person, only as a shape that was about to put rounds into the boys below. She'd already dialed for distance during the approach. 400 meters, slight elevation. The wind at this height pushed left to right, maybe 2 miles per hour based on the slow drift of smoke from a burning trash pile. She settled her crosshairs a fraction off center, exhaled, and pressed the trigger. The recoil came back into her shoulder, familiar and controlled. Through the scope, she saw the man jerk as the round punched through his chest, then disappear backward into the darkness. She shifted without thinking, sliding to the next likely window, watching for a flicker of movement. There, another shooter loping along a rooftop, hunched over a rifle, moving to a better vantage. He glanced toward the street, then toward her building without really seeing it, not expecting death to come from the north. She led him by a fraction, estimated his pace, and let the second shot break. His head snapped sideways, body crumpling against the low wall and rolling out of sight. Below, the Rangers were still catching their breath, pinned. Someone shouted, "We can't see where they are." And then the radio call went out, strained and confused. Is that a girl firing? She heard it distantly, part of the noise but not important. What mattered was a machine gun team that had just sprinted into the gutted shell of a storefront further down the block, the PKM's barrel dipping as the gunner dropped to a kneel behind a blown-out window frame. He was still settling the bipod when she put the crosshairs on his chest and took up the slack. Third shot. His body folded, the PKM clattering from his grip. The assistant gunner flinched, hands flying to the man's shoulders, mouth open in a word she wouldn't hear, then ducked and dragged the dead weight back from the frame. She let him go. He wasn't the threat anymore. On the net, voices overlapped, then cut off as Captain Davis stepped in, his tone carved from steel. Alpha, this is 6. All stations, maintain discipline. Mark your contacts. Northern Overwatch, keep engaging. That's an order. Roger, Hale said automatically, but his eyes were no longer on the scope. They were on her. He'd stopped scanning, his hands hovering near his spotter's scope without actually using it, watching as she shifted to a new firing position, adjusted her bipod a centimeter to get lower, rolled her shoulder to ease a cramp, then found a new target. Rudd, off to the side, had gone quiet too, his own rifle forgotten for the moment. She ignored them. Another shooter appeared, this one behind a balcony railing, muzzle poking through the gaps as he tried to rake the street where First Squad was huddled. Maya saw only the sliver of face between the rifle and the concrete. It was enough. Fourth shot. A puff of red mist, the body collapsing straight down, rifle clanging against the railing. A man with an RPG darted into view farther back in the alley, fumbling with the weapon, trying to find a line of sight over the smoke drifting across the street. She had to shift off her biped, going to a supported kneel, elbows digging into rough concrete as she snapped the rifle to her shoulder. The shot felt wrong for a heartbeat, rushed, but her fundamentals held. Fifth shot. The RPG clattered to the stones, the man falling half on top of it, fingers twitching once before going still. Down below, the pressure started to ease. Rangers began to answer with controlled volleys, their machine gunners, freed from the PKM's dominant lane, leaning into their triggers as they chewed up the faces of buildings where muzzle flashes had come from moments before. A fire team bounded forward to drag a wounded soldier into cover, the man's leg leaving a dark smear on the dusty street. More of the enemy ducked away from windows, confused by the new angle of death they hadn't anticipated. Hale swallowed, keyed his MIC, his voice stripped of its earlier easy arrogance. Alpha 6, this is North Overwatch. Confirm 4 enemy KIA, multiple additional suppressive engagements. Friendly elements are advancing, he said, the words coming out slow, almost reverent. Rudd finally picked up his scope and started scanning again, but when he did speak, it was half to himself. Holy hell, he muttered. The ambush didn't end with a dramatic last stand. It just collapsed. The ISIS fighters, realizing their carefully designed kill zone was leaking blood on both sides, began to pull back, slipping through interior stairwells and down alleys that Maya couldn't see or reach. But the damage was done. The Rangers had taken hits. Yes, a couple of men down. But the slaughter that had been planned, the line of bodies that street was meant to hold, never materialized. Instead, they pushed through, clearing the nearest buildings with violent efficiency, stacking on doors and blowing hinges, their anger honed into technique as shouts and gunshots echoed up through the concrete under her elbows. By the time the shooting died down, Maya's shoulder ached, her cheekbone was sore from the scope, and sweat had streaked paths through the dust on her face. She rolled her stiff neck and took one last slow look at the street, verifying no new movement, then saved her rifle. For a moment, nobody spoke in their little rooftop world. The air seemed to buzz. Hale finally sat back, rubbing his jaw. Cortez, he said quietly. No trace of condescension left, just something like disbelief. How many shots did you fire? She shrugged, mentally replaying her trigger pulls. 7, she said. Maybe 8. Lost count. He huffed a short, humorless laugh. Didn't seem like it. They exfilled with the rest of the element hours later, the sun high and merciless, the weight of the day hanging over every man staggering back into the FOB. Medics hurried toward the wounded as the vehicles rolled in, stretchers appearing from nowhere. The usual post-contact chaos swelled and ebbed. Maya moved through it like a ghost, unslinging her rifle, clearing it, and heading toward her tent. She hadn't made it far when a runner in a sweat-stained T-shirt intercepted her. Staff Sergeant Cortez, he asked, breathless. So wants you in the TOC. Inside, the plywood bunker hummed with generators and whispered conversations. Captain Davis stood near the map table, arms folded. Around him were the platoon leaders, a handful of senior NCOs, and a man she didn't recognize at first, older, gray at the temples, warrants on his chest, the battalion intelligence officer. All of them looked up as she entered. At ease, Davis said, then nodded her closer. Staff Sergeant, we just finished debriefing the platoon leaders. He tapped a section of the map corresponding to that deadly street. By everyone's account, we should be looking at 3 KIA and a couple more critical right now. Instead, we have 2 wounded and no dead. Every squad reported accurate, sustained overwatch from the north, taking out key shooters and that PKM before it could lock in. I've seen the helmet cam footage. He paused. Where'd you learn to shoot like that? She shifted her weight a little, feeling the eyes on her like extra weight on her kit. She could have given them the short, safe answer, Army training, sir, and left it there. Instead, something in the room, in the way the younger Rangers wouldn't quite meet her eyes, nudged her toward a little more truth. Ramadi, sir, she said. 2006. I was attached as a designated marksman to 1 to 6 infantry. Went through sniper school in '07. This is my 4th deployment. The warrant officer straightened, the faintest spark of recognition flaring behind his tired eyes. "Ramadi," he repeated. "You were with 1 to 6. "Yes, sir." He stayed for a beat, then let out a breath that sounded like it had been waiting inside him for years. "Hell," he said softly. "We were in Ramadi same time. I was on the other side of the river, with 1 to 9 cave intel. There was a story going around back then about a female marksman they attached to the infantry companies. She covered some of the nastier routes, IED alleys, sniper corners. They said she had more confirmed kills in 6 months than most snipers get in a career." His gaze sharpened. "That wouldn't happen to have been you, would it?" Maya didn't flinch. There was no pride in her answer, just a simple acknowledgement of a history that had never really left her. "That's exaggerated," she said quietly. "But I was there." The room went still. One of the younger lieutenants, who'd laughed at a joke about a babysitter 2 days earlier, shifted his weight, a faint flush creeping up his neck. Staff Sergeant Morrow, the one who'd questioned her assignment to the rooftop, looked away, jaw tight. The silence carried a different weight now. Not dismissal but recalibration, all their mental math scrambling to account for a reality they hadn't bothered to consider. Captain Davis didn't make a speech. He just nodded once, tight. "Well," he said, "I don't much care what stories are true or not. I care what you did today. You kept my men alive. You're staying attached to this company for the rest of this operation. We need you on those rooftops." "Yes, sir," she replied. That was enough. Outside, the sun was dipping toward the horizon, staining the T-walls orange. She stepped out of the TOC and let the warm air hit her, the noise of the FOB washing back over her. The clatter of gear, the distant thump of a helicopter spinning up, someone laughing too loudly near the laundry hut as stress came out sideways. She'd only gone a few steps when she heard boots on gravel behind her. "Staff Sergeant," Hale called. She turned. He slowed to a stop a couple of paces away, helmet tucked under one arm, his hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. For once, he looked uncertain, the easy confidence stripped away. He scrubbed a hand over his face, searching for words. He started, then shook his head. "Back on the range, when I said you were not bad for a first-timer, and when I didn't know." "You didn't need to," she said. "Yeah," he replied slowly. "I did." He met her eyes. "I was wrong." Today, he groped for a way to describe what he'd seen through his scope, the clean inevitability of each shot. "I've never seen shooting like that under that kind of pressure. I mean that. You saved lives. Mine included." For a heartbeat, the corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile. "It's just the job," she said. "Maybe," he said. "But some people do the job different." Over the next 2 weeks, the operations continued. Street after street, building after building, the slow, ugly work of pushing an entrenched enemy out of a city that had already been broken and remade too many times. Wordless changes showed long before anyone said anything directly. Nobody called her babysitter anymore, even as a joke. No one questioned when she took point in discussions about vantage points or fields of fire. In the mission briefings, when routes were drawn and objectives assigned, Captain Davis would glance at her range cards, ask for her input on likely enemy sniper hides, and factor her answers into his plans without comment, as naturally as breathing. In the chow hall, she no longer ate alone at the far end unless she wanted to. There was always an empty space at one of the ranger tables, someone sliding over a tray to make room without fanfare. The conversations didn't suddenly become about her. They were still about home, stupid internet memes, arguments over which MRE was the worst, but every now and then someone would lean over and ask her something small. "Hey, Staff Sergeant, when you were in Ramadi, did you guys see as much indirect as we're seeing here, or you ever have a round skip off a rooftop and still hit target?" And she'd answer in short, plain sentences that somehow did more to educate them than a dozen PowerPoint slides. Once, between missions, Specialist Keen, the same one who'd blurted out the question on the net, found himself alone with her at a sandbagged smoking area near the edge of the compound, the sunrise painting the sky pale pink. He shifted awkwardly, cigarette between his fingers. "Hey, he said finally. About what I said on the radio, asking if you were a girl firing. His ears went a little red. That was stupid. She looked at him, then back at the hazy horizon. You were under fire, she said. You were allowed to be stupid for a second. He huffed a little, relieved. Still, he said, won't happen again. One evening, after a long day that ended with more paperwork than bullets, she sat on an overturned crate outside a tent, cleaning her rifle. The sun melted into the horizon, leaving behind bands of orange and purple, the light catching on the oiled metal of her bolt as she rubbed carbon off with a rag. The familiar ritual soothed her, each piece of the weapon small and precise, each pass of the cloth a promise that when it mattered, the rifle would not fail her, or the men depending on it. She could hear distant laughter, the thump of someone's boot against a soccer ball, the faint call to prayer drifting in from the city. A shadow fell across her hands, and she looked up to see Staff Sergeant Morrow, hands shoved into his pockets. He nodded toward the empty spot on the crate beside her. This seat taken? He asked. She shook her head, and he sat, watching her work for a moment. I've been doing this job a long time, he said finally. Seen a lot of people rotate in and out. Some talk big, some don't talk at all. Most of them, you kind of get a feel for what they can handle pretty quick. He paused, picked up her rag, then set it down again, like he was afraid to touch the rifle itself. I made a call on you before you ever stepped off a truck, hey? That call was wrong. Maya didn't rush to fill the silence. He nodded, accepting that. Anyway, he added, clearing his throat. My guys know who was on the gun that day. They won't forget it. Neither will I. He stood up. If you ever need anything, extra ammo, better spot, whatever, you come to me. We'll make it happen. Roger, Staff Sergeant, she said. That was more than enough. No medals were pinned in dusty ceremonies on that FOB. Those things came later, in quiet buildings half a world away, if at all. Out here, recognition didn't look like a piece of ribbon on a chest. It looked like a nod from a lieutenant who used to ignore you when you spoke up in a brief. It looked like being handed the best glass the unit had without argument. It looked like a seat saved in a full vehicle, or a ranger handing you the last bottle of cold water without making a big deal about it. It looked like a young soldier, the same one whose life you'd covered with a precisely placed bullet, stopping by your bunk before rollout to say, if you see me doing something stupid out there, don't be nice about it. Just tell me. On their last night in Mosul before the unit rotated out for a different sector, the Overwatch team found themselves on the same rooftop they'd started from, the one where she'd taken those first shots. The city below was still battered, still dangerous, but quieter now. ISIS had been pushed back, their black flags down in this part of the grid. Hale lay back, hands behind his head, looking up at a patch of sky that was finally free of smoke. When we get home, he said, they're not gonna believe half of what happened out here. Rudd snorted. They never do. Hale turned his head toward Maya. You going back to your old unit after this? She shrugged. Wherever they send me. You could do worse than staying with us, he said. It was half a joke, half not. We're slow learners, but we get there eventually. She smiled, small and quick. We'll see. Later, when the plane lifted off and the FOB shrank into a smudge of gray and tan, she sat by the oval window, watching the land that had shaped so much of her life recede. She thought of Ramadi's brutal streets, of the first time she'd lain behind a rifle and realized someone's son would not go home because of what she did. She thought of all the times since then that she had walked into rooms like that TOC and watched people's eyes slide past her, their assumptions filling in the blanks before she ever spoke. Some part of her had stopped caring about their reactions a long time ago. Another part, quieter and more stubborn, still kept count. In the months and years that followed, stories from Mosul would drift through the Ranger community the way stories always did, patchy and half-exaggerated. The ambush that didn't become a massacre, the unknown shooter on the net, the staff sergeant with the quiet voice and the ruthless trigger finger. She'd hear about them sometimes on later deployments, her legend detached from her name, and she'd let them float by, saying nothing. It was enough to know that when someone now asked, "You sure you want her up there?" there'd be at least a few men around the table who'd answer, Yeah. We're sure. On a stateside range one day, years later, a young private with a brand new rifle and shaking hands would watch her drop 10 rounds into a 600-meter target in a group so tight it might as well have been one hole. His mouth would fall open. Then he'd clamp it shut, embarrassed to have doubted. How do you do that, Staff Sergeant? He'd ask. She'd clean her rifle in the golden light of late afternoon, the cloth moving over metal with the same patient care as always, and she'd think of the street in Mosul where a kid had asked, half panicked, if the voice on the net belonged to a girl. Like that somehow made the shots less real. She'd think of Ramadi, of all the places in between, of the weight of every assumption she'd cut through one trigger pull at a time. It's not about talent, she'd say quietly. It's about respect. Respect for the rifle, for the job, for the people on the other end of that radio. She'd snap the last piece back into place, check the action, and set the weapon down. Respect isn't given. It's earned one shot at a time. And somewhere, on some dusty street in some other city, another unit would hunker behind a wall and hear the clear, measured crack of a rifle from a rooftop they hadn't noticed, and someone on the net would start to ask a question about who was firing, then stop, thinking better of it, because by then they'd have learned that the only thing that mattered about the person behind the glass was that the shots landed where they needed to, when they mattered most.